You know, folks, I've been thinking about that conversation about grand narratives, and I think I've figured out which is the most important one. The largest mass migration in human history is happening right now all over the planet. The UN itself estimates that about 250 million people are on the move every year. And that's going to rise in 2050 to over 500 million people. We're talking about economic migrants, refugees, and even landed immigrants. Almost all of these folks are people of color from Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America. And this is provoking the unfounded perception among white people all over Europe, but also among Euro roots people throughout the Western world, including Canada, that whites are under attack, that somehow they will soon begin to lose their rights. Many of them are reacting to, as the last poets foreshadowed almost 50 years ago, and then Public Enemy reprised in the early 90s, the fear of a black planet. The implications of this mass migration are both staggering and profound. Immigration quotas, the rights of immigrants and refugees, job markets, the fear of ongoing terrorism, permanent refugee camps, the changing demographics of most Western countries, new dangers to women, children, and LGBTQ folks of color, the false utility and clear limitations of Canada's multiculturalism policies. All of this against the backdrop in Canada of increasing racism and specifically Islamophobia. And finally, what this human migration means to art practices and arts policies in the territory that we now know as Canada. And that's just a few of the implications.
Well, I understand what you're saying, and you're right about the unprecedented human migration. And paradoxically, I would say that it is in part because of these massive migratory movements that we have to focus on indigeneity, now more than ever before. As more and more people move away from their homeland, as they are displaced, and they lose their direct link to territory, and consequently to histories, to land-based knowledge, cultures, and art practices. I firmly believe that the grand narrative of our time is rooted in indigeneity. We urgently need to recenter and deepen our connection to the land. By land, I mean the indigenous sense of land, you know, the soil, the water, the sky, the plants, the animals, all creatures, and what is beyond, the dream world, the spirit world. That connection to land is grounded in ancestral knowledge and the memory of here, of how to live here on this vast territory that's now called Canada. Indigeneity is a way of life that values memory, that celebrates the resilience and generosity of our ancestors, that understands our interconnectedness. Indigeneity is a worldview grounded in a vision of change that leads to harmony with rather than control over the environment. And it is precisely what the world needs in these times of great human migration.
Well, listen, I don't want to insult Indigenous people. I really don't. I mean, I even had a Native friend back in high school, so I know about indigeneity. I think I met her at Expo 67 now. But really, France, living close to the land, how practical is that? Most of the world's citizens that are on the move are in fact moving to cities everywhere on the planet. More than 3 million people relocate to cities every single day. We humans as a species are becoming more and more urbanized. I think if Indigenous folks want to live their traditional lifestyles, then sure, go ahead. I've got no problem with that. But indigeneity being useful to the rest of us, I think that being the most important grand narrative in the world today, I just don't see that. Indigeneity, while of course it could be somewhat useful in some limited ways, is basically knowledge from the past.
Well, Chris, I'm happy that you had a friend, an Indigenous friend. And if you're telling your age by saying that you met her in Expo 67. But now please let me make something clear. Indigeneity is not something only of the past with irrelevant knowledge to this postmodern world, you know. An indigenous lifestyle is not a one thing. It is many things. Indigenous people have an amazing capacity to adapt to new environments and circumstances. They have survived 500 years of colonization, after all. And over 50% of the indigenous population in Canada is in urban centers. I think it's time to let go of some of your assumptions. There are impressive numbers of people transiting into cities, you're right. And there are new people coming to Canada every day. You're right about that as well. The logic of resource extraction and consumption still dominates the ethos of our everyday lives. These factors are creating immense pressure on the planet. I would say that indigenous environmental and cultural knowledge can guide us in adopting more sustainable practices.
Okay. I do see the point about indigeneity connecting to environmental concerns. Okay, that's critical. But I still think that indigeneity as a grand narrative doesn't work. How does indigeneity impact the lives of the folks that I'm talking about? The movers, the folks fleeing war, violence, rape, religious hatred, famine, persecution based on gender or on gender fluidity, or even those people who are simply seeking better economic prospects for themselves and their families. These folks are the forgotten residue of 500 years of colonial domination all over this planet, of the rearrangement of their homelands, their nations, and their cultural identities, of the resource extraction and cultural appropriation of the contemporary neo-colonial world we live in today. These folks are like colonial chickens coming home to roost. For me, this largest in history, and at an ever-increasing rate, human migration is the grand narrative of our time.
Well, my answer to you, friend, would be it all goes back to the land. Why are so many people leaving their land, their country? Would they leave if they could live in peace? If they could freely enjoy artistic and cultural expressions? If they could provide for their families? If they could access education and well-paid employment? Making human migration the grand narrative of our times is focusing on the effect, not the cause. The grotesque wealth inequalities and the corporate control over what are, in actuality, common resources like water, land, plants, minerals, are what is creating the conditions that drive migration. Dealing with underlying causes is complex and challenging. This is why it's easier to focus on symptoms, you know. Still, I think that we are at a juncture, at a turning point. We are witnessing a phenomenal resurgence of indigenous cultures, including customary and contemporary artistic practices. The call to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission are accelerating this direction, one that acknowledges our collective past while actively pursuing concrete and holistic changes. Indigenous ways of knowing are central to the grand narrative of the future. Chris, I would like to come back to the concept of land because I think there are very different understandings of what it means and what it implies. From an indigenous perspective, the concept of land is vast. From it come the people, the languages, the rhythms, the stories. Indigenous art forms are connected to the land in their materiality, in the continuum of their practices, and their connections to the spirit of the land. They inform us of where we've been, of where we are. They ground us. Indigenous arts are unique to this land. They exist nowhere else. This is their homeland. For Indigenous people, the idea of land is also associated, sadly, with the stealing of land, with histories of displacement on the land, of broken treaties about land, of interminable land claims negotiations, and of resistance to extermination of Indigenous land rights.
You used an important word a few minutes ago, and then you just said it again, homeland. Migrants do have a sense of land, and it perhaps even overlaps with what you are speaking about, but in another sense as well. Which is to say that the idea that land is central, that can be apparent in every culture. Land influences language, culture, food, jargon, worldview, and from it art forms have developed and are still practiced. But the other sense is this word homeland. For Indigenous people, land is homeland, as you just said. For migrants of all types, land becomes homeland, and that becomes memory of homeland, and that becomes home almost as a mythic space. That's why so many immigrants, especially first generation, but also second generation, hold on to facsimile lifeways of the homeland. Food, music, argot, dress, dance, and visual signifiers. Yet, they somehow must also deal with land as landed, the new territory under their feet, with new ways of knowing, new smells, new regard, new activities, new idiomatic expressions. And this is often a struggle to be who you are, and yet at the same time to fit in the face of ridicule and racism. Certainly you're right, France, that learning the history of Indigenous people here on this land is imperative. Yet, it's usually overlooked.
Well, I understand their challenge. I mean, how can you make your peace with the idea of landing in a country that has such a troubled history of cultural genocide, of displacement and starvation, indeed of legislation, the Indian Act, intended to terminate Indigenous existence?
Yeah, good question. I'm not sure I can answer that. To me, it's not that people of color do not care about this, but rather, depending on their situation, there are much more pressing realities. But I also think in Canada in 2017 that this is changing. Artists are playing an important role, both in situations like today and over this week, where we talk about this and try to understand it, but also in their art process, in their actual practice. One thing you could say about artists of color is that they know about the lasting damages of colonialism. They know about the systemic racism that has embedded itself in all of Canadian institutions. So even if it is naive, there is a natural compassion for and with Indigenous people. Ignorant of history in many instances? Yes, of course. But usually open and usually with a willingness to understand. There is little or no defensiveness there because there is little or no guilt. The vast majority of people of color are not settlers.
That's an interesting point about the guilt factor. I'm going to have to think about this one a little more. But, you know, by the way, speaking of pressing realities, for Indigenous communities with no running water, overcrowded moldy houses, crumbling schools, and high level of poverty and suicide rates, especially among young people, the welcoming of immigrants and refugees can be hard to understand. You know, this is difficult to express. But there is resentment in Indigenous communities regarding refugees. It's hard to witness the kindness and generosity of Canadians towards the new arrivants when you feel invisible, marginalized, ignored on your own land.
Yeah, of course you're right about that. But I would say that you don't deal with an injustice by ignoring another injustice. The Canadian state can and must do both. The real question for me is why are Indigenous realities almost mostly invisible? I think there's lots of answers to that question. And number one is that to deal properly with Indigenous reconciliation, Huge amounts of money, billions of dollars, will need to be reallocated. Land issues, huge amounts of land, will somehow have to be dealt with. Secondly, the roots of these realities that you're talking about go deep. And really owning up to that history will not be easy for non-Indigenous people. There is no quick fix. We're not going to fix and reconcile by the end of 2017 like it's some kind of race to get it done. Thirdly, I think the refugee crise du jour, the crisis that we're in at any given moment, is an easier, far less costly fix. Oh, those poor people from Vietnam, or from Uganda, or from Somalia, and now from Syria. Let's be good Canadians and help them out. But this speaks to what you said earlier, underlying causes and reasons. What is the underlying reasons for this refugee crisis, for any refugee crisis? How is Canada and Canadians implicated in this history? We rarely ask these tough questions.
Yeah, good point. We are implicated as a country. We are implicated collectively. And I think that on an individual level, it is also much easier to feel good about helping refugees than to be confronted with your own inaction, guilt, or shame when it comes to the situation of First Peoples of this land. But you know what? Maybe the real conundrum here is one of clashing worldviews, not the billions of dollars for land settlement or land claims. Maybe the problem is the very idea of land ownership, of unrestrained resource extraction, including cultural knowledge extraction. Maybe the issue is one of attitude. Actually, it is the attitude that flows from the ideology and hegemony of capitalism. You know, the one that assumes that everything is up for grabs? From land and resources to ideas and symbols. The attitude that artistic freedom and freedom of expression have nothing to do with cultural appropriation.
Yeah, I think we heard that recently in the news. You know, speaking of resentments that you mentioned, and it is a bit of a secret too, it's tough for me to say this. One occasionally hears from artists of color that cultural racial diversity has been pushed off the table because Indigenous arts issues are now taking up so much space. To which I like to respond, you don't deal with an injustice by ignoring another injustice. This has been 500 years in the making, and personally I find Indigenous patience and Indigenous survivance remarkable. Grace combined with militancy, extraordinary resiliency. The current resurgence in Indian arts is dynamic, Indigenous arts is dynamic, breathtaking, and inspiring. Indigenous artists are not taking up space, as I hear. They are reclaiming the space that has always been theirs, as the first creators of the first arts practices on and of this land.
If we're going to talk about art practice, I think it's imperative to keep in mind how the Western artlands has shaped the understanding of Indigenous art and how it still overshadows Indigenous art practices today. What you and I call the Western artlands is not a straightforward instrument that one can look through and clarify things in a simplistic way. It is better seen as a deconstructive methodology that can identify the many ways in which Western art history both glorifies European artists and your art forms, and at the same time denigrates, appropriates, or ignores those art practices from other peoples in the world. Colonial history has constructed a way of seeing and understanding that privileges the assumptions, beliefs, philosophies, attitudes, and logic of the Western world. It is a complex, potent mix of constructs of jurisprudence, anthropology, and politics. And obviously, it has ramifications for art.
It does indeed. We have taken time to tease out, through our research, some of the constituent components of this Western art lens. So here we go, I'll go quick. First is anthropology. After 500 years of colonialism, the cultures that dominate the world are mostly Western in their history. The Western art lens then comes to be seen as a common sense way of codifying the world and the peoples who live in it. We all know that despite these anthropological preconditions and preconceptions which play out to our present day, there are protestations that all of these other art forms only exist in the past. Primitivism. The various notions of primitivism were developed from as far back as the Enlightenment, and they laid the theoretical groundwork for colonialism. Indigenous people and other peoples around the planet were framed as uncivilized, as somehow lesser. The term primitivism, when applied to the art of others, implies that particular attributes of objects are understood as an alternative to the more refined, the more developed, and the more skilled objects of Western art history. Another component of the Western art lens is the notion of authenticity. Works that were not influenced by Europeans, while not exactly considered art, were still sought after because they were authentic. This creative purity somehow continued through the last 2 centuries, despite attempts to wipe out Indigenous and other cultural practices at the same time. Paradoxically, authenticity, nominally a laudable concept, did not really create a level playing field. Authentic, maybe, equal in stature, certainly not. And it tended to stunt the development of any theories or art discourses surrounding the production of these art forms. If something is not really art, no need to talk about it, no need to write about it.
The notion of fixity is still often imposed on the artistic and cultural production of Indigenous peoples and people of color around the world. Fixity is the formulation of peoples as timeless, unchanging, traditional, collective, irrational, ritualized, and pure. Let me quote Homi Bhabha.
I'm glad you're quoting Homi Bhabha.
Well, it's such a small quote. Who expands upon this concept and how it works. He says, an important feature of colonial discourse is its dependence on the concept of fixity in the ideological construction of otherness. Fixity as the sign of cultural, historical, racial difference in the discourse of colonialism is a paradoxical mode of representation. It connotes rigidity and unchanging order, as well as disorder, degeneracy, and demonic repetition. The stereotype is the major discursive strategy. Finally, there's also the question of appropriation. This art historical line from colonial contact through primitivism, through notions of authenticity and cultural purity, through invisibility and art history, leads directly to current debates about cultural appropriation. And I would like to turn to Cree Métis filmmaker Loretta Todd commentary on this. She says, the valorization of peripheral cultures is frequently undertaken through acts of cultural appropriation, colonial cultural appropriation, in an extension of the concept of property and colonial conquest. Many settler artists do not value or respect cultural difference, but instead seek to own difference, and with this ownership to increase their own worth, their own cultural capital. They become image barons, story conquistadors, and merchant of the exotic.
You know, while we're on this topic of deconstruction, there's an issue which is controversial on our territory. I'm a little hesitant to touch it, but I feel that it needs a deconstructive airing out. And it relates directly to our theme of land landed, but it is a bit touchy. Obviously and unequivocally, Indigenous people are the first peoples of this land. For me, that fact should be the basis for respect, appropriate inherent rights, putting Indigenous worldview and art practices at the center of the Canadian art system. All that and more is a given. But then, who is everybody else? The non-Indigenous people. Are we all settlers? For me, this is a contentious division. For the most part, with a very few notable exceptions, people of color arrived to this territory long after the settling, don't like that word, had been enacted. Generally speaking, we are not settlers, nor are we descended from settlers. Some of us are descended from slaves. Although not in the same way, artists of color have also been marginalized by the Canadian art system with their ethnic, or folkloric, or traditional, or even at times primitive art forms. And if we do hope to decenter the Western art lens, I say let's squeeze it from both chronological perspectives. Those here before all of this settling, for me settling is destruction, land grabs, cultural genocide, swindling, lies, and then those arriving after most of this settling took place.
Well. This is complicated. And you know what? I will not be the spokesperson for Indigenous people on this contentious issue. In fact, I can see every side of this question, all positions around the circle. And I understand the urgency of recognizing Indigenous rights and respecting treaties and honoring the cultural knowledge of the land. And I understand people that defend the fact that this should be the primary because it informs the lives of everyone else living here, settlers and immigrants of colors. At the same time, I recognize that many people of color have experienced and still do their own anti-colonial struggles. And they have a shared history of racism, marginalization, and appropriation. These conversations will all be part of the reconciliation project of the next decade, I think. Because people of color, generally speaking, did not settle the land, as you say, they bring different and useful perspective to this conversation. But I think we will need the truth first. You know, it's not called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for no reason. I really think that the truth has to come first. We need the whole truth before reconciliation can take place. First, what is the real collective story? Displacements from homeland, dishonest treaties, extinguishing of rights, assimilationist policies, starvation strategies, cultural genocide. But secondly, what is your real personal story? As uncomfortable as it can be, it is a necessary step to the process. Canadians will have to learn to be more comfortable with discomfort.
Speaking of reconciliation and discomfort, this is a term I am uncomfortable with. It seems to me that to reconcile something, let's say a human partnership of any kind, you first have to have conciliation. A moment when things were together, when they were okay, when there was an equal relationship based on transparency, leading to trust. I don't know when that conciliation ever was. Yeah, there were moments of genuine partnership in this territory's history, but those were fleeting. I think, France, this is one of the truths that you speak of. The people living on this territory cannot reconcile easily without tracing Canada's history properly and honestly. Trust cannot be based on lies, or worse still, platitudes about, oh, that's all in the past and then we're really, really sorry now, so let's move on. We are living with the past in our present. Before anybody freaks out that we're not supposed to burn things in here, we forgot the part about colonial institutions. Oh well. This is not going to last very long. Seems to be a problem with lighting fires in BC. Okay. Talking as argument, as we did, as conversation, even injecting a bit of theory, because after all, this is an academic institution. Each of these can be useful, but if we're going to be able to somehow make sense of this, we have to seek something deeper, more complete, more interconnected, something that can weave discourses together rather than just simply counterpose them. Colonialism's great. No, it's not. It's bad. We need something more than that. Walking around the tree to see all the perspectives that actually move us forward. Let's try to communicate in a way that is once holistic, heartfelt, acknowledges political reality, and ultimately remains ethical.
Well, the artistic language can be in that realm. And as we both know, elder and scholar Willie Ehrman calls this way of relating to one another the ethical space of engagement. Ehrman says that the ethical space is formed when two societies with disparate worldviews are poised to engage each other. This partnership model of the ethical space holds the potential, I think, to create new currents of thought that can overturn the archaic ways of interaction.
So, then, if we're talking about art, using the concept of the Western art lens to decenter the European art forms as universalist and therefore superior, how could the ethical space be used to confront the historic racism inherent in the Western art lens framing? How do we negotiate an artistic landscape that offers artworks from so many traditions, so many cultures, all on this territory? How best to present these artworks? How best to receive them? How best to understand them in multiple discursive frames? What are the implications of all of this for art history, for resource sharing, and for arts policy? How can we take this current structure, this circle, with white in the middle and red somewhere off in the corner and the various other colors of the folks who live here around this circle so that everything is referencing, and change it into a circle where red is at the center, where we all understand what we've been talking about, and where white still has as much space as it has, but it's to the side. And it does not take 95% of the resources that support the infrastructure that supports arts practice. Of course, we don't have the answers to this, so let's let the audience deal with that, okay?
Good plan. I want to come back to the question of reconciliation, if I may. Because I think it is important to understand that it's a long-term process, that it's something that is not going, as you said, to be solved at the end of the Canada 150 celebrations. In fact, one could say that celebration is the very antithesis of reconciliation. And actually, Monica gave us many examples of that this morning. Celebration can shroud the truths, can cloud the memory to preserve a kind of Canadian multicultural naivety. So then, what does real reconciliation look like? What role do Indigenous artists play in this conversation, if any? Is it their responsibility to educate non-Indigenous audiences? How do communities of color, especially the new arrivants, find out about the real stories of this country, this country's history, that still impact Indigenous communities today? Do artists of color have a responsibility in this process? How can they respectfully engage in centering indigeneity in the artistic landscape of this land without giving up their own subjectivity as artists, their memory of land there, and their lived experience of land here?
Yeah, you're right. Official multiculturalism reinforces these very Canadian myths, these myths about tolerance and inclusion, as if we live in some kind of multi-culti paradigm. And it actually works to reproduce the dominant myths of the Canadian state. After all, Canada is a new country with 2 founding races, 2 founding nations. We're bilingual and multicultural. In this formulation, Indigenous people are erased from history until some sensitive bureaucrat in Ottawa or Victoria takes another sip of coffee from the eco mug and says, whoa, 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 what about the natives? And then, of course, they're added on, they're included. Talk about insulting. This frame really needs to be jettisoned. No more is this the story of Canada. New creation stories for the territory called Canada are urgently needed. And any serious reconsideration must put Indigenous artists, their history, their practices at the center. Artists from all backgrounds can be exemplars in imagining these, both as historical facts, but also as new mythical spaces.
Yeah, I agree with you that the idea, the formulation of Canada as a new country that is inclusive, that includes Indigenous people, our Indigenous people, is totally misguided. It is Indigenous communities, in fact, that have historically been welcoming, and there's a long tradition of caring, of sharing, gifting in Indigenous culture. It is the Indigenous people of this territory that have done the including. Once visitors are in your house, it is your responsibility to look after their well-being. Indigenous people have done that with the newcomers for 500 years, sharing food, medicine, knowledge, and even sharing land. It is that generosity that got us in trouble with the settler in the first place, I think. But that spirit of generosity prevails today. As Métis journalist Betty Ann Adam says about new immigrants of color, and I quote, "Those with white skin have no right not to welcome those people when they come, when they do." She further explained, "Anyone who's not Indigenous is living on this land that was stolen from our people. This was our land, and you're all welcome. And we will continue to honor the treaties, and we beg you to all do the same."
You know, France, that's your work?
I think it's your work.
Huh. Maybe it's all of our work.